They are skilled miners and stonemasons, artful blacksmiths and jewelers, with lush facial hair and a height that is, let's say, below the human average. But they more than compensate for this with their endurance and a will as tough as stone, which often turns into stubbornness. And they would prefer the vaults of cool holes carved inside the mountains over the pleasant spring sun. Dwarves, you might think. Of course, the title literally says Dwarven Fortress. Almost, I would say. Welcome to the Synthetic History channel, where we talk about events that didn't happen as if they did. And today, I will step away from the stories based on Paradox interactive games that are familiar to me and my subscribers, and immerse you in a story from another game, Songs of Syx. A remarkable fantasy city builder with empire management elements and massive battles where thousands of soldiers can participate simultaneously. And the main characters will be the Dondorians, the local equivalent of dwarves. I will tell you about their distinctive traits as the story progresses. Well then, enjoy the show. The story began approximately in the year 836, from the end of the Great War of the Gods, on the ruins of the Telapian Empire of Dwarves, which previously spanned the entire northern continent and which, 2 years ago, suffered a heavy defeat by humans in the Battle of Stalistia, which greatly accelerated its decline. The power vacuum was filled by all sorts of former governors, leaders of humans who invaded these lands in the last century and united into the Kingdom of Ameria, local petty nobility of lizardmen, and other bandits. The citizens of Dwarves themselves, at the time, would surely have told you that their empire would still prove itself to the world, since they even had colonies remaining in the south, across the sea, and they would certainly take back their western lands from the arrogant humans. But this obviously did not happen. It was onto this not very fertile soil that 36 Dondorians arrived from the south. Before this they were personae non gratae across the entire territory of Dwarves. They were literally exiled few centuries ago, which is connected to what can be called, without exaggeration, the Telapis' hatred for Dondorians. And indeed, in many ways they are complete opposites. Some love mountains, other forests, some love beer, others liquor, some pray to the patron of craftsmen, Asuri, others praise the patron of farmers, Crater. However, the dwarves themselves, I hope you don't mind me calling them that occasionally, treat the Telapis normally, tolerantly, I would say. There are several explanations for such one-sided animosity. The obvious one is that the Telapis were created by the gods to protect nature, while the Dondorians were created to reshape it for their own needs. And since protection is a constant process, whereas once you've made a change it works for you for a fairly long time, there is a little reason for the dwarves to hate the Telapis, and much reason vice versa. I will tell you the second reason, which is usually promoted by the Dondorians themselves, later. So, now that these lands were no longer forbidden to live in, 36 dwarves concluded an agreement with one of the local petty princes, an emperor. Yes, don't be surprised, back then every second ruler called themselves an emperor. It was the fashion. Emperor of Dwarven Gronk the Ace, and purchased from him a small plot of land near the Smithon's Rest Mountains, naturally after concluding secret geological surveys beforehand, which showed that the mountains were rich in various ores, gems, primarily sapphires, and granite. One place was especially rich in them, and a settlement was founded in a cave at their intersection, which after brief consideration was named Holbor, in honor of the oldest member of the expedition, Holbur Gurbux. He was 89 years old at the time, and Dondorians usually lived to be 150. From this moment, their chronology begins, meaning it was the first year. I will use this chronology from now on. The dwarves' first major goal was to create infrastructure for the extraction of all those wonderful minerals. However, first, several problems had to be solved, starting with the arrangement of living space. In the beginning, while there were a few of them, they tried to adapt naturally formed caves in which future houses were hollowed out. Thus, a rather cozy courtyard was created. Next, it was necessary to acquire a stable food source. One cannot eat stones, after all. Initially, they engaged in hunting bolticrawlers, huge white larvae found in the mountains and their surroundings. Yes, they don't look like much, but some say their meat is quite tasty and rich in all sorts of nutrients. I haven't tried it. The settlers themselves, however, did not think so, and wanted to switch to normal food as quickly as possible. Mammal meat, fish, or mushrooms. Probably few of us can blame them for that. And to get this food, it had to be bought. Farming, after all, is not for Dondorians. And for this, they needed money, which they planned to obtain by selling the mined gems. Tools and equipment were needed for their extraction, which had to be manufactured on site. Wood for them was harvested in the same place where the larvae lived, and for its extraction and transportation, they specially carved out a new exit from the mountain. All this took approximately 3 seasons, and by the time other Dondorians, who also decided to try their luck in the north and heard about the emergent settlement, began arriving in Holibor. There were about 80 of them. With their help, the first gem mine was completed within a year, and the trade agreement was concluded with Dwarven. In exchange for gems, they received fish. It was the cheapest food of what Dondorians prefer to eat. And timber. Dwarves do not consider felling trees a worthy occupation, so whenever possible, they pushed it off onto others. After the news of the sapphire mining reached the south, and Dondorians love digging for gems, for them it's something akin to loot boxes, because you never know how large and pure stone you will find tomorrow. The number of dwarves wanting to settle here increased many times over. People came to the settlement in literal columns, and by the 4th year, the population was already around 300 people. Creating infrastructure for such a crowd was quite difficult, especially considering it had to be hollowed out in the mountain, so they had to save space. And instead of a relatively cozy courtyard, they have since built long corridors of identical houses, each housing 10 people, while there were quite few open spaces. These were the central square with the market and smaller squares at the crossroads. Moreover, such a layout is quite common for Dondorian cities, even if they developed at a slower pace. The reason for this lies in the rather unique physiology of the Dondorians. The thing is, they are not born from a mother's womb or from eggs, but literally spawn in the mountains or forests near the living places of other Dondorians, already at an adult age and having all the necessary knowledge for processing metals, wood, stone, and gems. And yes, they are all men. And yes, they have no genitals. So there were no brothels in their cities. In general, it is believed that dwarves were the first creation of the gods, so they became, so to speak, a trial run, with obvious pros, as they say, born and immediately asking to go into the mine. A government's dream. Schools aren't needed, birth rates don't drop, etc. But also with noticeable cons, which I will tell you about later. Because of this, dwarves are often nicknamed the first robots, and the Dondorians themselves believe that the Lapis hate them because the former were created by the gods first, and the latter second. Anyway, such physiology had a huge impact on the social order of the Dondorians, as it is literally a race of immigrants. They have no homeland or family in the sense of other races. And being by their nature quite grumpy, they often change their place of residence if they were dissatisfied with something. And they were dissatisfied often. Thus, the first 36 colonists left their previous place of residence, the city of Neslau, because, I quote the chronicle, they were fed only mushrooms and forced to work in coal mines, which for an honest Dondorian, as everyone knows, is a shameful occupation. Plus, they didn't have their own representation there. The nobles were exclusively hogmen. So immigration and emigration led to a constant turnover of the population, and in such a case, making houses for different preferences was pointless. Therefore, in the end, dwarven fortresses always resembled a factory or an anthill, to one degree or another. And the absence of family and children led to an absence of inheritance, so all real estate in the city, such as mines, workshops and houses, was considered the property of the city. Speaking of property, by the 4th year, the city added another gem mine and a granite mine, and several carpentry workshops to create furniture for themselves and for sale. Holibor became quite a decent little village, and there was, so to speak, something to profit from. But it was still not developed enough to protect itself from enemy attacks, which is what bandits tried to take advantage of. The first such bandit was Dunter One-Eye, who by the way was not one-eyed, the leader of a small band of only 10 people. However, these were well-equipped, experienced fighters, most likely deserters. Though according to the dwarves themselves, they were hired by Gronk so they would become afraid and voluntarily come to him for protection. Such a version has a place, because he literally led them onto the lands of Holbor, and he didn't have the money for a permanent garrison capable of holding the Dondorians under control. The latter, of course, did not go to Gronk for protection, but stubbornly prepared to defend their gems from ill-wishers themselves, having at their disposal only 15 people, somewhat trained for battle, plus hammers used in the quarries. Not much, but they had dwarven bravery and a bit of ingenuity. Between the main large cave, where the settlement was located, and the entrance to the mountain, made earlier, there was a smaller cave. When the robbers entered this cave, the dwarves blocked their passage to the main cave with stones, and because their eyes had not had time to adapt to the darkness of the caves, they became an easy target for the squad of dwarves hiding there. They made a powerful onslaught and then retreated, gradually inflicting injuries on the bandits. Generally, the chronicles describe every such dwarven charge in detail, in a way as if it were not skirmish of 15 against 10, but a great battle. So most likely the chronicler who described these events participated in them himself. Besides, they were described roughly 20 years later, so I would call them memoirs. In any case, under the blows of the invisible dwarves, the bandits began to panic and tried to clear the blockade, which became a fatal decision for them, and in the end, they all died there. Also, one brave Dondorian, Goin McGrunt, died. Well, at least his name was remembered. After this victory, the town continued its development. The corridors with houses lengthened, as the number of Dondorian wishing to settle here did not decrease. When their number reached approximately 600, this was in the 7th year, they faced a new problem. Darfin's demand for dwarven gems hit the ceiling. Humans, of course, are great lovers of shinies, but even their desire to accumulate jewelry has a limit. Gronk decided to sell the extra stones to neighbors, and therefore imposed duties on the gems to thus lower their price for subsequent resale. So the dwarves' income began to fall behind their food expenses, which very quickly turned into a famine. There were even cases of cannibalism. Naturally, the residents were not thrilled about this, and began to quickly clear out of the city, which overall solved the problem for a while, as fewer people for the same number of gems mined meant more food. Still, they harbored a grudge against Gronk for these duties even then. And for more than 500 people to live in Holbor, new ways of obtaining income had to be sought. A temporary solution was to increase the variety of goods for export. Thus, by the 12th year, they began buying textiles and making clothes from them, engaged in processing the mined granite, which is a rather difficult process, so they earned quite well from this too, and finally started mining ores, which for dwarves was only slightly better than mining coal. But as I said, these measures were temporary, and Gronk imposed duties again. It became obvious that it was necessary to reach larger markets with their goods, and for this, Gronk had to be convinced. First, a place for the permanent work of letterers, an embassy, was built for this, and then these sycophants began to convince Gronk to open the borders for Holborian traders, and for this, they had to give him a large tribute. Then it was necessary to give bribes to the representatives of Emeria, with whom the dwarves intended to trade, and all these offerings were made not in money, but in goods, because they had no extra cash. Everything went toward buying materials and food. And having given away this pile of goods, they found themselves in a situation where they lacked money to purchase materials to create new goods for sale. In economics, such a situation called a liquidity crisis. But this knowledge was clearly not embedded in the Dondorians during their creation. The crisis, however, was not very serious. There was no large-scale immigration, but there are mentions that in houses they pulled up floorboards to manufacture furniture for sale. More dangerous was the fact that with the expansion of trade, rumors of the dwarves' wealth spread wider, and more powerful bandits began to take interest in them. The first such bandit was Arno the Red, commander of a large detachment of 100 well-trained and armed insects. I think such a gang could simply capture Holbor, if they wanted to. So when they demanded tribute, Holbor paid it, especially since by the time their economy was in order. Although dwarves are brave and love a good fight, they are clearly not madmen, and their 50 somewhat trained and equipped people would clearly not have been enough to resist. Naturally, after such a demonstration of Holbor's weakness, smaller bandits became interested in them. 2 years later, the commander of Telapian bandits, Walla Scarecrow, demanded tribute. But in those 2 years, the dwarves had built up a militia of 120 people, who already had not only hammers, but also spears. They still didn't have enough money for armor and shields, though, and they weren't manufacturing them yet themselves. However, even such forces were more than enough to defeat a detachment of 30 bandits in an open field. The latter clearly expected less resistance, but took the fight anyway. That was when what would become the standard tactic of Holbor's troops was first used. Soldiers with spears tied the enemy down in combat, and then shock infantry with hammers smashed into their back. Caught from two sides, the enemy soldiers panicked and began to retreat in disorder, and they were all finished off there. Well, we have talked about foreign policy, if it can be called that. Now let's return to domestic matters. All this time, the town continued to develop, and its population surpassed 1,000. That's already a fairly large crowd. What I am getting at: all questions concerning the life of the city were previously resolved at a general assembly. It was direct democracy, which was convenient while there were few residents. But you can't carve a large assembly hall in a mountain. Who knows, it might collapse and bury everyone. And going outside for this is kind of not dwarfish. In addition, living by the principle of a commune forever was difficult, and the process of social stratification began in Holbor. A leader appeared in every industry, who with the help of his charisma, management skills, and often tall stature — the average height of an ordinary Dondorian was about 120 centimeters, while such a leader was 145. It's hard to even call such guys dwarves. You get it. Became their director, so to speak. Initially, there were 5 masters over the gem, stone and ore mines, and masters of the masons and carpenters. In general, with a stretch, they could be called nobles. For example, they had servants and their own district with magnificent chambers, but I would rather call them deputies or ministers, because due to their physiology, power was not inherited. In short, they gradually concentrated power in their hands, and mass assemblies began to be held less and less frequently and only on very important issues, like declarations of war. But such a change in the political system had a rather positive effect on the development of the city. The efficiency of production and mining grew under competent control, and with the accumulated wealth, the budget finally became a surplus. They began to buy meat and mushrooms, providing a variety of food. They lined the main roads and squares with statues and columns, built a stage with performers on the main square, put guards in the main alleys, and built a prison in the darkest and most remote part of the cave. Because with the growth of the population, crimes grew exponentially, and these criminals began to be caught by the guards. And all because the only way for these deputies to raise their standard of living, besides the cool housing they were allowed to have, was to raise the general standard of living. They also began to care about the development of science, and organized a laboratory where all sorts of innovations were developed to speed up production and the extraction of minerals. Thus, they finally began to produce their own metal tools. The first forge was quite small, but it was sufficient for the needs of the time. They also organized a large jeweler's workshop, so that instead of selling raw gems, they could sell processed ones and, of course, various jewelry, which increased the added value, and consequently, the city's income. Next, they decided to ensure that descendants, or rather future residents of the city, knew how cool they were and what past they had carved. They built a library, where in fact they began to write the Chronicle of Holbor, on which the story is mainly based. Complaints and mistakes were also in it, of course, but it is interesting that according to the chronology of the chronicles, the mistakes of these deputies were written after their deaths. Like, this scoundrel couldn't correct the position of the storage space in the mine, and they asked him about it for 3 years. And well, if he had already corrected it, then they wouldn't write about it. And there were not that many complaints about them in the chronicles. You will understand why, I guess. In general, they developed gradually like this until the year 23. The population was then about 1,700, and their old friend Arnaud the Red decided to drop by to, well, do what bandits usually do. This time the dwarves were ready to fight back, as their militia already numbered 170 trained people. They even had shields. They gave battle in an open field and used their standard tactic. From this moment on, it can already be called that. First, the infantry with hammers distracted the enemy's heavily armored infantry. Then, due to the fact that the dwarves still had no armor, which meant it was easier for them to run, they dashed toward the light infantry locked in combat, and struck them in the back. Then, when they faltered and scattered, the dwarves mounted a new onslaught, and so on until all the light infantry retreated. After all, the main thing in the battles of antiquity was not to physically destroy the enemy, but to make them run away. The heavy infantry was the last remaining, and being alone in a clear minority, they also scattered, though due to their heavy armor, they failed to escape. Arnaud died at exactly that moment, and all his belongings, worth 300,000 dinars, passed to the Dondorians. But Holbor's problems didn't end there. After the battle, a demand came from Gronk for the payment of 60% of Arnaud's belongings, saying, "I was the one who led them into your lands, so part of the money is mine." Top tier rage bait, I would say. The dwarves, of course, refused. Then he demanded an even larger tribute of 800,000 in honor of his jubilee. He was turning 75 then. After an obvious refusal, as this was about a quarter of the value of all Holbor, not the GDP mind you, but exactly the combined value of houses, workshops, workers. Gronk broke the agreement on the passage of traders between Dwarven and Holbor, which effectively meant a blockade that would have resulted in the deaths of most residents from hunger. Most likely, here my opinion coincides with the chroniclers, Gronk, or perhaps his daughter and cousins, it seems he himself was peace loving and they urged him into war. Though the rage bait seems to have been his idea, it's hard to say. Had approximately this plan: exhaust the dwarves through bandits, and then force them to attack using trolling and the blockade. The blockade was probably more important, after all. And overall the plan worked. Having no other choice, the dwarves gathered equipment, accumulated rations, and went to war. Right at the border, a Dwarven detachment of 70 people was waiting for them. But then they saw that there were almost the same 170 dwarves there, and moreover quite heavily armed ones. They even managed to get some armor. And in Dwarven they didn't know that just as many fought against the bandits, and their losses were insignificant. In short, almost the entire detachment immediately scattered, leaving their baggage train, and Gronk had to bring out the militia, 310 poorly trained light infantrymen, and the remains of the escaped regular army. However, the numerical advantage against the Dwarven phalanx was rather a disadvantage, because these yesterday's peasants, upon entering battle, began to crowd. They could not organize an encirclement of these phalanx, which you could say rotated along with the enemies, and the guys with warhammers, hitting from behind, made them constantly look around to see if they were about to get hit in the balls. Well, because it wasn't easy for the dwarves to reach their heads. After some time, unable to withstand such tension, they gradually scattered, leaving only the archers from their regular army, who unsuccessfully tried to hit the Dondorians in this bloody mess. They tried to swing swords for a while longer, and this time they failed to escape. Dwarven remained practically defenseless, but since it was the former Sverver's fortress, the walls there were very solid, and it was impossible to take such a fortress with a head-on charge, so they laid siege to it. This siege lasted about 6 months, and in the winter of year 24, Dwarven ran out of food and surrendered to the mercy of the dwarves. Gronk died of a stroke about a week before the end of the siege, and the Dondorians hanged all the other members of his family. Around the same time, Holbor ran out of food too, so you could say they were also under siege. They just happened to last a bit longer. But the food caravans from Ameria and Zwervers, they were able to conclude a trade agreement with the latter, cause money became more important than principles for the Telapis back then, managed to reach Holbor before a social catastrophe began there. By the way, the ruler of Zwervers during their decline was Empress Gronk VII, and the ruler of Dwarven was Gronk VIII. He took such a name and the title of emperor to annoy the Telapis, as if to say, I am the next ruler of the empire. He was an excellent rich baiter, for sure. Anyway, now the lands under Holbor's control included places that took more than a few hours to reach. They had to be managed somehow. Appointments made, reports received, taxes collected, in general ordinary administrative tasks. Plus, from this moment, Holbor became a subject on the political arena, not just a bunch of artisan and minor communists. Now ambassadors had to be received. And for all this, some main guy was needed. A ruler. Especially since there were only monarchies around, and being the only oligarchic republic in the region seemed strange. In short, the dwarves decided to choose a king for themselves. It was the head of the most profitable industry, gem mines, Dristan Gurbox. They shared a last name with Holbor, if you remember him. And most likely it was a coincidence, as dwarves are very respectful of the names they claim are given to them by Asuri himself. But this coincidence very likely gave Dristan additional votes in the elections, as if Asuri knew it would be so. Holbor himself, by the way, was still alive at the time and was working exactly in the gem mines, not very engaged in politics. If you are interested, he lived until 44, dying at the age of 132. Although to be honest, it's hard to say. Mentions of him just end in that year. He was working as a jeweler then. In any case, Dristan's election as king did not significantly change the balance of power, and was closer to a formality, and the hold continued its life. The dwarves built a stone road to Dwarven, so that caravans from neighboring countries would find it easier to reach Holbor. They also began to improve the equipment in the mines, which improved their productivity and possibly worsened their safety, but more on that later. The rise of Holbor frightened their new neighbor, Namak, and the latter, thinking of nothing better, sent them a message with insults, threats, and demands for tribute. Well, war it is, then, the dwarves decided. Beating the arrogant and weak is always fun. The battle with the lizardmen militia proceeded in the usual way, although these ones couldn't even attack together. While the dwarves were finishing one squad, another unsuccessfully struck the back. In the end, they were beaten, and Namak simply had no one left to defend it. Thus, the growing Dwarven realm, in year 26, was supplemented by another territory. At this point, opportunities for expansion ended, because they were squeezed between two large countries. Not that they really needed it, they were more interested in a good fight than in conquests, especially since the taxes collected there were ridiculous by Holbor's standards. But nevertheless. However, 9 years later, they had such an opportunity, as the turbulence in Zwerver's politics reached its peak and resulted in a civil war. It was a sin not to take advantage of such an opportunity, and they invaded the land of Vogelbach, defeated the garrison, and captured it. They didn't go further, because order had to be established in these lands first. And then it somehow became not the time for wars. Anyway, what was happening in the life of the Hold during these years? Population growth slowed. By year 37 it was about 2,700, but in turn their quality of life grew significantly. Ration portions doubled, the amount of clothing tripled. Included with the bread, in their case, mushrooms, were circuses. That's exactly what they built in the central square. There used to be an embassy there, but it was moved closer to the entrance of the fortress, the latter having been previously leveled and widened, and the lockup for the temporary detention of offenders. That was moved near the prison. Near the central square, on the site of the former training ground, they organized an open court so that the people would know that justice works fairly and not just anyone is put in prison. The training ground itself was moved south, to a new residential block. There they built the largest hospital and clinic, the first for the seriously ill and wounded, and the second for the rest. And so that the nobles who lived nearby wouldn't cross paths with the sick in case of epidemics, they put a gate on the border with the noble district. Speaking of nobles, their number increased to 10. They became the masters of the jewelers, weavers, blacksmiths, potters, and the head over the colonies. They decided to give this responsibility to a separate dwarf. Qualitative changes also occurred in the economy, as the income from the export of manufactured goods exceeded the income from the export of minerals. This was ensured by the construction of new stone-cutting workshops, and the jeweler's workshop, huge for the time, for 220 people. And everything was going quite well, until a tragic accident occurred in the gem mines in year 38, as they delved too greedily and too deep, which caused a collapse that buried dozens of miners and King Dristan himself, who was in the mine for an inspection then. Dondorians declared a week of mourning. After all, a king had died, but the chroniclers mostly complained that he forbade them to drink piva. Well, not exactly forbade, he just constantly found valid reasons not to buy beer. Like, it's expensive in the north, winter grains hadn't appeared yet, we better spend the money on something more worthwhile. And the people fell for it. Chroniclers claimed that this was because piva gave Dristan diarrhea, and in the hold where he lived before, he had to miss feasts because he would have been laughed at. They wrote that he even organized the first tavern, but there was still no beer. And what fool would go to a tavern where you can't get drunk? Duh. It's hard to say how much of this was true. Maybe he just wanted to promote a healthy lifestyle, and his acquaintances from another hold slandered him. In essence, a new king had to be chosen. Elective monarchy, by the way, was the most common political system among Dondorians. While Redonfiot, the master of the jewelers, became king. The dwarf's choice emphasized, so to speak, the growing role of the manufacturing industry. First thing, he organized the purchase of beer, which indeed made the budget deficit for a while. So Dristan wasn't lying. Then the dwarves organized a second tavern in the place of the carpentry workshop, which was moved south, and demolished the old small forge. There was already a larger one in the north then, and in its place a large statue of Dristan was put up, as if watching over the gem mines. In year 43, news of bandit raids began to reach from the south. They had increased in number and audacity, taking advantage of the civil war in Zwervers. Dondorians, of course, defeated them. Some bandits even dared to attack Holbor, they were also beaten. And the dwarves decided that order should be restored in the south. Plus it would be good to have an outlet to the sea for expanding trade independence. So they went further and captured Yakins first, and then Waktven. Thus they gained an outlet to the sea and concluded trade agreements with empires in the south. The caravans and ships went to Holbor from distant lands. Over the following decades, the hold continued its development, growing its industry and population. In the 50s, it surpassed 4,000. This number is an approximate limit when you stop knowing everyone through one person. That is, all your acquaintances know everyone else in the hold. This meant a need for establishing a more developed bureaucracy. Plus, the lands captured earlier also required control. And it wouldn't be bad to keep more stable trade records, because now goods came from different places and went to different places. And how much of what to buy and to whom to sell turned into a rather complex task. For this, an administration building was built. And so that it didn't feel like it was on the edge of the city, the natural entrance to the cave was remodeled into a magnificent tunnel, decorated with statues and columns, so that those walking through it would understand how wealthy the residents are here. At the entrance to the tunnel stood walls with gates, fairly small ones, and then behind them they built huge walls of white granite, with wall-mounted catapults, a warehouse for throwing stones and equipment, and very thick gates. Actually, there were as many as 4 gates there, just in case. The old tunnel remained functional for a while, because a cemetery stood at the entrance. But when the crypt was built, where most dwarves were buried from then on, the entrance became unnecessary and was replaced by a wall with catapults and 2 towers, for controlling the mountain perimeter. They also spent a pile of money on decorating the main square. Runes of pure gold engraved in granite a stage decorated with gems. They also began to develop the Syphilan ore deposits located nearby. For its extraction, a small village was built there. To be honest, the significance of Syphilan, or rather Syphilan ore for that time, is not very clear. After all, the technology for its processing was lost at that moment. Magma-based smelting, for one, was invented some 400 years later. And as for application in anything other than alloys, we are talking another 150 years or so. However, for Dondorians, Syphilan had a rather sacred meaning, and it manifests on physiological level. The dwarves themselves say that Syphilan was present in large quantities where they originated from, and it reminds them of that place. Therefore, they used it as, well, do you collect anything? Figurines, cards, coins, achievements? Well, multiply your love for such items by 4, and that will be the Dondorians' love for Syphilan. Also, it's simply pleasant for them on a metaphysical level that they have a large supply of this ore in the warehouse. Actually, such a warehouse stood right next to the mine. It stood there and raised the mood of the people in the hold. They even took it on military campaigns. A pile of ore just lay in the baggage train and raised the soldiers' morale. There were also coal deposits nearby, but as I said, digging coal is a shameful occupation for a dwarf. So they bought it from less picky neighbors. By the way, same as metals for manufacturing tools, jewelry and construction. They didn't engage in smelting either, as it was more profitable from a logistical point of view to sell ore and buy metal. Technical progress did not stand still either, and technological solution of humans began to reach the dwarves with traders. All sorts of machines, production methods, things that simplify labor. Humans, as the latest creation of gods after all, possess the most flexible minds, which is why science comes to them most easily. And heated disputes took place in the hold then, about how to handle these new technologies, to adapt them or to refuse them. Moreover, the nature of the Dondorians is revealed in this dispute, because it is usually the older dwarves who are proponents of progress, as they know from their own experience that there are cases when the knowledge embedded in them at birth may not be as effective as what's invented. And the young, on the contrary, want to work with what Asari gave them, and said that new technologies would remove the need for becoming a master. In the end, they decided that money was more important than principles, mainly because the deputies were over 80 years old, and began to apply human innovations. Over time, this problem haunts Dondorians more and more, especially after the start of the Industrial Revolution. After all, the knowledge with which Dondorians are born does not change at all, while the world continues to develop. So for them, learning new professions is approximately as difficult as for a human to enter university at 50 years old. That is, it's possible, but difficult. Not for nothing do humans have a saying, a dwarf requires everything to be explained tenfold. Anyway, so they developed further, until the civil war ended in Sververs in year 58. Gronk finally managed to beat the rebels. Naturally, she wanted back the lands captured by the dwarves during that war, and even demanded they return Dwarven, old Tilapian fortress. After that war, Sververs' army was experienced and quite large, 3,000 people, so the threat was not empty at all. But Holbor prepared for such a turn of events, and they had 600 people armed to the teeth, the best plate armor and weapons. I performed calculations, and the average cost of equipment for one soldier was 8,500 dinars, which equaled the cost of annual food for 100 dwarves. Huge money. Plus the hammers were mounted on horses supplied to them from Yakins, and thus the dwarves gained shock cavalry. Plus they had catapults in large numbers. In short, for the war with Sververs, they were very much prepared. It began in year 60, when Sververs troops, numbering 2,000 people, crossed the river, which was the conventional border between them. Officially recognized borders naturally did not exist. Holbor sent 500 of its best dwarves there, leaving 100 in the hold just in case. That's where the battle took place. The dwarves deployed their troops in an arc to guard the catapults, which dealt the main damage. and placed the cavalry on the left flank. The infantry took the blow without much trouble. They were even flanked and hit in the rear, but the Telapis simply couldn't pierce their armor. Then the cavalry hit them in the back, the default tactic for Holbor, but the horses increased the impact potential. Because of this, the initially weaker Telapian left flank collapsed, and the dwarves rushed to the aid of the right flank, surrounding and finishing off the enemy. The battle ended in a complete defeat of Zwervers, at the cost of the lives of 40 brave dwarves. After this victory, the latter went to besiege the border fortress of Versletten, which, even with the presence of catapults and the crushing of the local garrison, took 6 months. Zwervers even offered them peace, but they, intoxicated by victory and wanting to end the Telapian threat, refused in an insulting tone. And that's when the problems started. They took the town, but during this time, news of the war reached Ameria, and there they realized that this war was ideal time to unite the continent under their power, and they declared war on Holbor, sending two armies with a total strength of 8,000 people to them. Beating such a menace with forces of 500 and actually 430 people by then would hardly have worked. But fortunately, there were quite a lot of armed people in the region ready to provide their services to reduce the number of soldiers in enemy armies, for a fee, and the dwarves had enough money to pay them, at least for a while. In general, they hired about 1,000 of the best mercenaries, mostly heavy infantry and cavalry, what they were used to commanding, and went to intercept the 5,000 strong army heading for Vogelbach. The battle began near it. The dwarves used the same tactic as before, but this time it misfired slightly, as the human cavalry decided it wasn't worth hitting the dwarven phalanx head-on, but better to bypass them from the side and strike the catapults. An amazing idea, and therefore the dwarves had to use the mercenary cavalry as a screen for the enemies, and the prolonged battle dragged on in the rear. The stalemate was broken by the dwarven cavalry, which remained doing what it did best, hitting in the back. As a result, the humans' left flank faltered, and the freed up forces rushed to help in the rear and on the right flank. It also helped that the enemy catapults couldn't reach the dwarven positions, because the humans figured they would smash the dwarves anyway and didn't wait for the thrown weapons to be brought closer. In the end, only the archers remained, who were finished off by the cavalry. Thus, a heroic victory was achieved. Losses amounted to 200 people, mostly mercenaries. Next they went to beat the second Amarian army, which had captured Yakins during the battle. This time the humans were not so arrogant, and their catapults did fire this time, but their cavalry was intercepted on the flanks, so the result was approximately the same. Both of the human flanks began to retreat at about the same time, so surrounding the remaining forces fighting in the center was quite simple. This time the victory came at the cost of 250 people. Thus, the invasion was repelled. However, while the dwarves were fighting the humans, the Telapis were able to gather a new army of 3,000, take back Versletten, and capture Vogelbach. Holbor's troops had to take the battle. They then had 900 people left, about 100 mercenaries having deserted by then. Victory came fairly easily, considering the experience of past victories and the fact that against them were poorly trained soldiers who began to flee at the first blow of cavalry to the back. Nevertheless, the dwarves lost another 80 people, and they needed to win back the lands, which was difficult considering their number was small and constantly decreasing. The money being spent on supplying the army and on mercenaries was also diminishing. One of the dwarven captains is credited with this phrase: "A few more such victories and nothing will be left of our army." After they took back Vogelbach, the Dondorians decided that nothing good would come out of field warfare anymore, especially since no one agreed to peace, and retreated into the hold, essentially dumping the mercenaries and the baggage train with Siphelon ore. For Dondorians, the latter was a very great disgrace. The mercenaries, by the way, were soon defeated by the Amarian army. The dwarves' plan was to wait out while Ameria and Zwervers beat each other. They stocked up on a huge amount of long-lasting food, and then conduct a confident counterattack. However, the Amarians, embittered by previous defeats, had other plans, They gathered a huge 12,000 strong army under the walls of Holvor and, without even trying to negotiate a surrender, immediately went on the assault, because feeding such a crowd for long was very problematic for them. The dwarves had about 570 soldiers ready to defend the city to the last, plus concerned townspeople who stood at the catapults. We have quite a detailed description of the battle. It was written live, so to speak. You can call it a recording of a stream. First, the humans decided to intimidate the Dondorians with the power of their catapults, and simply in 20 minutes leveled a rock that stood on the approach to the mountain. Fortunately for the dwarves, they had placed a cavalry detachment in ambush outside the city walls, and with a powerful charge wiped out most of the engineers preparing to set up those catapults that were supposed to shell the walls. For the cavalry it was a suicide mission, and in the end most of them were killed. However, in the defense there probably wouldn't have been a place for them anyway, so they understood that this feat was their only chance to influence the outcome of the battle. In the end, the besiegers had to change their plans. Fortunately for the latter, they apparently had a map of Hold's layout, drawn up by their traders or someone else, because they decided to divide the army in two. Some, more prepared and equipped, began the assault on the gates, while others were forced to dig in the tiniest section of the mountain, separating them and Holvor. And they did this despite the fact that their very dense ranks were shelled by the tower's catapults, inflicting huge damage on them. The first group was also shelled, and they also took decent damage, but they were not so bunched up. After a few hours, they knocked out the gates, and the fierce fighting began there. Instead of the broken gates, a steel wall awaited the humans, made of shields and spears and glued together by dwarven muscles. But on the side of the humans were numerical advantage and size, and the avalanche of human mass crashed onto the dwarven phalanx wave after wave, gradually exhausting the Dondorians' endurance. Initially it was planned that they would alternate, like one squad would replace another on the front line, and that one would go for a break. However, when it came to the battle, this idea turned out to be not just mediocre, but disastrous for the Holvor's army. Crowding began in the dense ranks, soldiers from different squads could not get to their positions, and the human troops began to push the dwarves further and further away from the gate, creating a breach. This led to the fact that the catapults, which were still shelling the enemy then, remained defenseless. The catapult operators, doomed to death, until the very last loaded stones pulled and released the levers. The defenders, realizing that fighting in the courtyard no longer made sense, retreated behind the third gate. And then, suddenly, a solar eclipse began, which is usually considered a bad omen in all cultures. At that moment, no one understood for whom it was a bad omen, so the morale of both sides dropped. And on the dwarves' side, one squad faltered, the one covering the other squads retreating behind the gates. This was a squad that had remained in the garrison during the war, and it was the one that was in front then, because of the unsuccessful rotation. The eclipse was layered on top of this, and here was the result: panic and surrender. Humans began to knock out the second gate, and after an hour and 10 minutes, it also fell. Moreover, it turned out that there were American spies in the city, because even during the war, someone had migrated there, and they broke the bolts on the third and fourth gates, taking advantage of the fact that they were usually never closed, and therefore no one checked them. This further undermined the morale of the defenders, and after 40 minutes of fighting in the tunnel, another squad threw up their hands and tried to run away. They were not succeeding. In the end, they just fell to the floor, begging for mercy. Because of this, the unified and then still quite solid dwarven formation collapsed, and they had to sacrifice another squad of brave men to give the remaining two squads the opportunity to regroup behind the fourth gate. They only found out that these gates were also sabotaged when they broke. But there were still about 20 minutes left before that, until the humans dragged the ram over the corpses and despairing soldiers. They finished off all Dondorians who showed signs of life. And misery did not come alone. While the dwarves were catching their breaths, news reached them that in the north, the second invasion group was about to break through the mountain into the hold. This was a blatant lie by the spies, as the humans by then had only dug half the way. But they didn't even think about it back then, and one of the two remaining squads went to close the hole that appeared in the defense. The second squad was soon forced to engage in battle alone, as there was already nowhere to retreat. In this squad were the most experienced veterans, some having participated in all of Holbor's military campaigns. But there were fewer than 100 of them left, and a powerful wave of infantry simply moved them further down the tunnel, closer and closer to the city. They held out until the last, trying to maintain formation, but it was broken right at the exit from the tunnel. During this time, the other squad had already managed to check the false data and returned to the front line, but it was already too late. They stood at the walls of the fighting pit, ready to take the last stand, and died there too. No wizards with thousands of horsemen to strike the enemy in the rear appeared. Blood spilled on the sacred runes of the main square's slabs. The statues in the tunnel silently watched the finished battle. The entrance to the hold and the surrounding white walls turned black, and the human troops, who never broke through to the coveted end of the mountain rock, largely became a mountain themselves. So many corpses were there. The eclipse ended, but the sun that reappeared no longer shone for the Dondorians, but for the Amerian Empire born at that moment, and Holbor simply became a part of it. In the north, the time of humans was coming. Half of the city's population, as punishment for resistance, was taken away as slaves to Ameria, and the other half remained to work in the mines, and in the coal ones too. This information, as you understand, was no longer taken from Dwarven chronicles. The last pages of the Holbor Chronicle were clearly finished in a hurry, and clearly by different authors. Then these records were taken to Ameria. There, surprisingly, the history of conquered peoples was treated with respect, and they have been preserved in local archives to this day. Thus, in the year 62, from the founding of the city, the history of the kingdom of Holbor ended. A story that any Dondorian could easily have lived through entirely, and would have called simply one stage of their life. Thanks to the patrons who still support me. Here they are. I think it's time to close it, because saying thanks to two guys is somewhat shameful for me, to be honest. Or just make all tiers cheaper. Would you give me $1 a month for being on this list? Anyway, if you like the video, then that's cool. You can direct that coolness to the like button. And if your first encounter with my channel was with this video, then you can watch my alternative history videos based on games by Paradox Interactive. I try to narrate and explain everything that is understandable even to those who have not played them. This video should serve as an example. Well, for now I bid you farewell.